Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Sussex Politics Society. I want to start by wishing all of you a very happy new year. And for those of you like me, who've recently finished your exams, I hope you're enjoying a feeling of freedom. My name is Mardi, and I'm the president of the Sussex Politics Society. If you're joining us for the first time, we're a student society at the University of Sussex who host world-leading politicians, diplomats, and experts to speak on the most important issues of the day. We played host to some incredible speakers last term, the videos of which you can find on our Facebook page, and we're very excited to bring you even more brilliant individuals. And in line with that, we are delighted to be joined tonight by Sir Vince Cable. Sir Vince spent the first part of his career as an economist and advisor, going on to serve as the chief economist for Shell in the 1990s, before becoming a councillor and then an MP in 1997. Rising up through the ranks of his party, Sir Vince was appointed as Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills in the 2010 coalition government, and in 2017 he became leader of his party and then became a prominent figure in the opposition to the Brexit vote, running a campaign on a platform of bollocks to Brexit. Now retired from politics, Sir Vince is a widely respected and admired figure in British politics, and we are thrilled to have him with us this evening. This evening's event will involve some remarks from Sir Vince, followed by a conversation between him, myself, and my co-host for this evening, the careers officer of the Society, Bradley Stewart James. And this will be followed by an audience Q&A. So if any of you have any questions during the event, you should put them in the comment section below. That's it from me. Sir Vince, welcome to the Politics Society.
Good. Well, thank you for your invite. You asked me to say something about British politics to kick off a discussion. I'd probably just stress I'm a now retired politician. I left the party leadership in mid-2019. We were actually in quite a good position at that point. We just had very good results of European and local elections, but I wanted to pass on to the next generation. And then I retired from Parliament at the end of last year, or sorry, 2019. And since then, I'm doing things in a non-political world. I've just got a book coming out in a couple of weeks' time on what's called Money and Power, which is about the interaction of economics and politicians. I look back as far as Alexander Hamilton and Peel in the UK and Bismarck, and forward to Deng Xiaoping, Thatcher, Trump, major politicians who've had a big impact on economics. And I'm midway now through a book on China, what I think is probably the big issue of our age, which is how and whether to engage with China or to confront them in some sort of Cold War, which seems to be what's happening. But I'm happy to talk about those and about British politics. But let me just start with a few comments on British politics. Now I'm an observer rather than a participant. I think what is strange, and people looking in will find probably difficult to fathom, is that in one of the most momentous years in British modern history, with the COVID and with Brexit, party alliances, allegiances have remained almost completely unchanged. The Conservative lead of Labour has narrowed a bit. It varies depending on the poll, but 4-6%. The smaller parties, including mine, the Lib Dems, have slipped back a bit, but we're still there. And we still have this entrenched SNP monopoly in Scotland. So the picture is unchanged, and one has to ask, why is that? You could say that Britain has had a uniquely unhappy experience with COVID. The biggest number of casualties per head in the world at the moment. A lot of obvious mistakes, but I think probably what's happened is that people have marked down the government, but probably shrugged their shoulders and taken the view that it was a difficult situation, nothing much to do with parties, and probably nobody else would have done much better. So I suspect that is broadly the mood. And even in the United States, where Trump was appallingly ignored and mismanaged the pandemic, there was only a very limited swing in the presidential election, despite Biden fighting his election largely on the failure of pandemic management. And the other factor, I think, relates to Brexit. I mean, it's very clear now that there is a majority of the country who, in fact, there was a poll out today which suggested that the Remain majority is now about 60-40. 60% think we'd have been better off staying in. But it has happened. Brexit hasn't had short-term catastrophes. It's had all kinds of short-term problems, which are very annoying for the businesses concerned and are going to impose considerable costs on the country. But because it's not been catastrophic, I suspect a lot of people breathe a sigh of relief and feel that, we're now going to move on. So I think the combination of those two things has stirred up a lot of apathy, to use an expression that Willie Whitelaw was once famous for. So my question then is, well, is there anything that can change that? Are there some big moments coming in politics that could change the way that people vote and people think? I think the first big issue is how we resolve the economic consequences. There's going to be a massive people are much poorer because the economy shrank, and we were already in a depressed situation where living standards hadn't risen for a decade because of the banking crisis, and now there will be even poorer. And moreover, there is a big inheritance of debt, public debt. There will be some people who are arguing that what we've just got to buckle down now and get the budget back into balance and repay the debt. That will be very much the Rishi Sunak approach to the problem. Others will say, well, we just can't do that. I mean, there are just so many problems, so much depleted capital in the public sector. We've got no alternative but to spend and continue to spend and borrow to spend. And it doesn't really matter terribly much because interest rates are low. And now who wins that argument will matter, I think. The Labour Party are beginning to present themselves as a party of financial orthodoxy again, as they did when 1997, when Labour got back into power. So they may not diverge from the government too much on its continued austerity agenda, but that's a big question for debate. I think another big issue which will define the way politics evolve is whether the government and the opposition parties feel that in some way the social contract of society needs to be recast. I mean, we now have a bitterly divided country geographically, by class, by age. A lot of people are going to argue that as in the post-war period, 1945, we need some fundamental change. And in particular, the question will arise as to whether we should pour resources into the relatively depressed areas of the north of England and the Midlands, the towns, also the seaside towns, which have fallen behind for decades, let alone the last few years, and their position has got worse. But that will run into the traditional conservative interest in the prosperous south of England, the older voters in the southeast who will not want to pay more taxes for that disadvantaged groups. And that's going to open up a big rift within the Conservative Party, and how they resolve that may well affect the rest of British politics. Another issue which has been dormant in Britain for a long time are kind of environmental issues. I mean, everybody says climate change matters, but it hasn't had any discernible effect on the way people vote. The Green Party, the Lib Dems have always been very vocal on environmental issues, but they got much credit for it. Greta Thunberg has been and gone and made an impression, but didn't change voting behavior. It's possible that next year, with the Bundestag elections in Germany, we could have Greens getting into the federal government. That may change in a radical way the way people think about green issues, or it may not. But that's a big uncertainty. And then there is the whole issue about British democracy being broken, which in many ways it is. I mean, we've had a voting system that's unrepresentative, a lot of disillusionment with the way parties operate, unfair influence, corruption in political payments, and so on. We've been talking for 50 years or more about political reform, radical decentralization. These things have never happened, despite the Lib Dems and others calling for them. And it may be that this is a time when something could happen. And the one big catalyst is Scotland, because it seems very likely that the nationalists will do extremely well in the Holyrood elections, which are due shortly, and then they will demand another referendum. There's clearly now a mood for independence in Scotland. In addition to all the independent supporters, there are a lot of EU Remain voters who didn't particularly want independence, would prefer to be ruled from Brussels than from London. And I think that will shift the balance. Now, if that happens, this has a knock-on effect on the rest of the UK, because the Labour Party can't win an election without Scotland. They're traditionally their big power base. They will then have to align with other parties, including the Lib Dems, the Greens maybe, to form some kind of common front to defeat the Tories. There's the issue about whether they align with the Scottish nationalists, which hitherto has been toxic in England. So that's, in a way, is the big kind of medium-term question as to how you get an alliance of what you might call progressive forces to challenge the Conservatives, assuming the Conservatives don't split on this north-south division. So those are some of the big issues. I'm happy to talk about those, happy to talk about some of the overseas issues which are bubbling up, notably around China. But I'll leave it to you to fire questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Vince. There's really a lot to take from them, a lot to unpack. But I guess the thing I'd want to start on, well, two questions really, both relating to our friends over on the other side of the Atlantic. You talked of China and how that is arguably the major issue that we face in terms of foreign policy in the 21st century. And I'm reminded of an academic at Harvard by the name of Graham Allison, who came up with this idea of the Thucydides trap. Looked at the dynamic and the relationship between an emerging power and an existing power, and whether or not there is an inevitability of conflict. And so do you feel that between the West and China, there is that inevitability?
Yes, well, I've read Allison's stuff, and it's in some ways quite convincing. I mean, basically, he goes back to Athens and Sparta and the times since when a new power has come to become a kind of hegemon, as I think political scientists call it. But the one big change that we in the UK are familiar with, of course, was that the UK was replaced by the United States in the 19th century. And that happened peacefully. After all, we speak the same language. A lot of Americans were British origin. It wasn't a sort of conflictual relationship, though it was at the beginning. We had a war, if you remember, 1812. The last time the capital was sacked by a mob was by the British Army in that war. But by and large, it was a peaceful transition. And then the Germans came along as a new potential hegemon, and we know where that led. The Japanese in Asia, and we know where that led. And we're now faced with the the reality that China now has a bigger economy than the United States, if you look at it in terms of purchasing power, a bigger economy, in many ways overtaking the United States technologically, not in every sector. I mean, the things like semiconductors, where America's several years ahead, artificial intelligence, but as we've seen with Huawei and 5G, they're well ahead of the United States. And so there is a kind of technological competition, which the Chinese are sort of catching up fast. And with that, with wealth, with economic size, and of course now with COVID, you can argue about how would the Chinese dealt with it initially, but they have been very successful in dealing with it. The Americans haven't. The Chinese economy is now growing again, 2 or 3% growth last year, the only economy in the world to grow. They could be growing 10% this year. The Americans are going backwards. It just increases the differential in economic terms. Now, what I would argue is that we have a great deal in common with China. You know, we need to have an agreement around the open trading system and trade rules. We need to cooperate with them on climate change. We need to cooperate with them on pandemics. But there are people in the West who want to pick a fight, you know, and you've heard stuff about alleged genocide and so on, and who see China as a threat. And these people are very powerful in the United States, where you've got this kind of coalition of the neocons led by Pompeo, the liberal Democrats who are equally anti-China at the moment, and the Trumpists. And it's a formidable anti-China coalition. And there's a lot of momentum behind it. And of course, the Chinese react, and they're reacting very badly and aggressively. And so the Allison thesis is currently being borne out. You know, hopefully it will be headed off, but that's where we're going.
Yeah, sure. You mentioned a few names in there. You talked about various individuals associated with Trumpism and the Trump administration. You also talked about the Capitol riots on January the 6th. Now we have a new president. We have a new administration. I guess there's so many different ways this question can really manifest itself, but I guess how I would start it is, I know it's quite broad, but with a change in the guard, with the years of, I suppose you could call it some degree of uncertainty or abdication of political norms and traditions, how does the idea of a liberal democracy in the US and I suppose even in the UK feel, and how strong is that foundation?
It's fragile, very fragile. And I don't know the United States terribly well. I mean, I've spent more time in India than I have in America, so that's slightly odd, my geographical interest. But I do get a sense from American politics that we're going through a good patch of a few weeks, but it may not last very long. You know, Biden is clearly a very, very sensible guy who's trying to get people reconciled and trying to build coalitions, and it's, you know, 100% decent. But you know, he's in a society that is hopelessly polarized. He will find it very difficult to get things done, you know, even with a nominal majority of one in the Senate. And when things are not being done, people get frustrated. He will start to be blamed for the fact that living standards are being hit, the fact that the COVID epidemic is still running riot, all those things. So he's got, you know, his honeymoon is probably not going to last very long. And then we've got a whole lot of people now positioning themselves to be the next Trump. I mean, I suspect Trump himself may well go into the sidelines. You know, he's set up a social media channel, newspaper, whatever. But I suspect that we're going to get, you know, somebody like Pompeo or you know, a very right-wing Republican muscling in on the Trump emotions. And in 4 years' time, taking us back to roughly where we were in the closing days of the Trump era. So liberal democracy in the United States is very, very far from secure. I don't think in the UK we ever got quite so far. I mean, we had a little dabble with populism with Brexit, but I suspect the currents in society are not as strong as they are in the United States. The British government, the Boris Johnson government, is going to find it difficult to establish a stable relationship with America because they regarded Brexit as very, very damaging and unhelpful. And a lot of rude things were said about Biden when Trump was in power by Johnson and his acolytes. I mean, the Americans are grown up and the Biden people are grown up and they'll forgive. They won't forget, but they'll forgive. And we get back to some kind of normal relationship. But I mean, to go back to your question, the answer is that liberal democracy is now very fragile. The only country in the world which is where it's really motoring actually is Germany. I mean, Germany actually has now become the great template for how liberal democracy should be done. It's an interesting historical reversion.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Sir Vince. I'm going to pass it over to Bradley now, who I believe has got a few questions about your time as a politician.
Yeah, so we're going to look a bit at your career now, if that's okay. So you were an MP, a minister, and a party leader during your time, and sometimes had these roles simultaneously. Which one of these roles, quite a simple question, which one of these roles did you enjoy the most, simply?
Well, the most testing, but also the most enjoyable, was being a Secretary of State, because I could really make a difference. I think I did. I made mistakes, as people do, but it was a very intense period. You're really living, you're working long hours, you've got constant decision making. So that was immensely satisfying, if difficult. I didn't enjoy actually being party leader. Partly the frustrations of leading a small party in Parliament. You really get called, quite difficult to get into the media no matter how hard you try. A lot of one of the things you realize that sort of petty intrigues that are happening in parties, all parties. It's hard work. And I didn't find that as satisfying. I think when I was a backbench MP before all this happened, I suppose my best period from a personal point of view was in the run up to the global financial crisis, when I got a lot of prominence as one of the people who had actually anticipated it and was regarded as the kind of point person to come to by all the media. So I mean, that was a lot of fun, but I didn't have any responsibility at that point. I was just a commentator. But yes, I think being Secretary of State was the most satisfying.
Okay. Yeah, well, as your Secretary of State, how did you find balancing the responsibility between not only your constituents, but also the industries across the country and the national constituents, the nation who you were representing at the same time, with all the policies that you implemented? How did you balance the views of all three different things whilst you're in government?
Well, the main balancing that had to be done was between the parties within the coalition, which was constantly tense, and I took a different view about it from Nick Clegg. I mean, I thought that we should be quite aggressive with the Tories and speak our mind, whereas Nick felt that what the country wanted to hear was that we were all harmony and agreeing with each other, whatever we thought privately. And his is a perfectly respectable point of view. My approach was more abrasive. But I took the view that, when we were in the department, we got on with our jobs, and I had a good working relationship with the Tories in my department. We had 9 ministers, 2 Lib Dems, and, well, sometimes 6, sometimes 7 Tories. Although we slagged each other off, we actually worked quite well and got things done. Balancing the national and the local was quite difficult. And ultimately, it was my undoing, because I lost my seat in 2015. I won it back again, but as a result of having been in the government for 5 years, I think my constituents, I wouldn't say turned against me, but I lost a lot of the popularity that I'd built up until that point. But I stick to the view, which I had before and after, that in a way, the most important thing you've got to do as an MP is to consolidate your local base. You've got to do your casework, identify with local issues. No matter how big and how important you are, you've got to cement your local base. Otherwise, you're not really doing your job as a politician.
Okay, thank you very much.
If I could just jump on that, Sir Vince, about the coalition itself, I think that really has to be one of the most interesting political phenomena, perhaps the 21st century, for sure, within British politics, because the ramifications of it are still with us at the moment. But I do want to just go back to it, and you've been called by some as the moral centre of the coalition, and I guess I was hoping if you could just take us into the back room of a coalition government what are the negotiations within that government over things like power, positions, and policy? How do they manifest?
Well, I think the way to start is to say that I think the coalition was right and it was inevitable. I mean, I didn't particularly like the Tory party. I mean, I'd fought them all my political life. They had different values from me. I didn't particularly want to have to work with them. But it was
because you did speak to Gordon Brown quite a bit, didn't you?
Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of respect for him. I saw him as a personal friend. I mean, I still do actually. I mean, we contact each other quite often. But there were circumstances in 2010 which made it politically necessary to work with the Tories, and there were twofold. I mean, first was the arithmetic of the election. There was no other way to form a stable government. You could, in theory, have had a coalition of all the minor parties, but it would have meant bringing in not just the Scottish nationalists, but also the Ulster Unionists, the Sinn Féin. Of course, they didn't turn up, but it would have been a real ragbag coalition. It would not have been stable. The second was that we were in the middle of a big economic crisis, and people have forgotten that. I mean, they just assume that the coalition did difficult things because they were being somehow sadistic or indifferent to public's sense of hurt. But actually, we were in a real crisis. The banking system had melted down. The banks were not lending. The system it was the sort of economic equivalent of a heart attack, and somebody had to take responsibility for dealing with it. Now, the only other option we had was to have let the Tories go into government, and for us to have supported them in a kind of supply arrangement, a bit like the DUP in the last parliament. But that would not have lasted because the Tories would have gone for a big majority within a few months. They'd have staged a second election, as happened in 1974, and they would have won a massive majority, and we would have been, well, I wouldn't say wiped out, but badly damaged and treated as a sort of trivial irrelevance. So we felt we had to be responsible. We were acting in the national interest. And get on with it. Throughout the period of government, there was a continued, arguments. I had perfectly friendly, but quite strong disagreements with Osborne and the Treasury on how, for example, you deal with public investment. I had quite bitter arguments with the Home Office and Theresa May about immigration policy, but these were arguments that were resolved, and we got on with our working relationship.
All right, thank you, Sir Vince. Bradley, I think you've got a couple of questions now on the future of the party.
Okay. So on the future of the Lib Dems, it's come to light that recently, I mean, I know polling isn't everything, but recently polling for the Lib Dems, hasn't been great compared to where it was a few years ago. The Lib Party's been taken over by the Green Party in quite a few polls now. I believe it was a poll only a few days ago which had the Lib Dems at 5% and the Greens at 6%. Why do you think this is? I mean, is this a lasting consequence of associations with the Conservatives in coalition? And why are the Lib Dems in a troubling position in the polls right now overall?
Well, we've been in a troubling position pretty much since 2010. If you look back at the polls, I mean, we went into the coalition with support of about 23%. It very quickly fell to 15, and then it fell to 10. And throughout the last decade, it sort of bumped along at about 10, 8 to 7, 8, 10%. And it's, as you say, the last few weeks, there have been some disastrous polls. I think my response to that is not to panic about it. When I was first chosen as a candidate in Twickenham, which was 1989, we got down as far as 3%. It didn't register on the poll because it was so small. You couldn't find any people who were supporting us. I think we actually were beaten by the Monte-Raving Looney Party in a by-election at one point. So it was as low as you could get. But within a few years, we did brilliantly well in the 1987 general election, doubled the number of MPs. I think we got 46 at that point, and recovered. When I became leader, we'd had two very bad general elections. In both cases, I think 7% in the aggregate, really bad, lost most of our MPs. But as a result of very good local elections in 2019, then breaking through in the European elections, we got up to 20 again. You know, we were back to our peak. Now, sadly, something happened in the 2019 election to take all that away, and we got back down into the pits. I honestly don't think there's a definitive answer as to why that happened. I mean, there are two theories, really. I mean, one is the one you just advanced, that there were kind of structural problems, that we'd taken a battering because of the coalition and we never really recovered. The other was that there was a series of mistakes made in the 2019 election. Revoke, you know, you can list them. You were there. I'm sure some of you voted, and that those are remedial, can be remedied under the new leader, who is, you know, a very sensible guy. But so I subscribe to the latter view. I mean, I don't think the damage is permanent, though it is pretty bad, and it is demoralizing for the troops on the ground that were trying to build up our position in local government, particularly.
Okay, thank you very much. So while we're talking about the future of the party, we actually have some audience questions which kind of tie into this perfectly, from Kate and Peter. So I'm going to kind of combine their questions. And essentially the question is, what is the path to a political comeback for the Lib Dems? Now, obviously that's easier said than done, and it's also a question of how do you define what a political comeback is for the Lib Dems, given the history of the party. But what would be your answer to that, do you think?
Well, I think it's very clear what the route back is. Whether it can be delivered, I don't know. But the first thing is to rebuild the local government base, which got very badly battered 10 years ago. When I was leader, we had two very good local government elections. We got in the two elections together, we got over 1,000 new councillors, but we'd lost, I think, 3,000. So there's still a lot of ground to make up, particularly in the north of England, in the big cities. I mean, you may not remember, but there was a time when the Lib Dems ran Liverpool, Newcastle, Sheffield, Oldham, you know, quite a few other places, and we're going to have to recapture that. We've made a start, but, you know, rebuilding the local government base is the first task. I think the second is, as we approach the next general election, if there is a mood in the country to get rid of the Tories, and I think there will be, and I hope there will be, it can't be done by the Labour Party alone. I mean, they've lost Scotland, and there's no way they can break through on their own. So there will have to be a tacit understanding with the opposition parties, and I don't just mean the Lib Dems, and the Greens have got to be part of the association. And the agreement would have to be that there are parts of the country where the Lib Dems are strong relative to Labour. I mean, a good example is Winchester, which we were talking about a few minutes ago. Winchester, Guildford, Cheltenham, Stockport, Hazel Grove, Cheadle, Harrogate. You know, there's a list of about 20 which the Lib Dems could win if they muster their own support and they get Labour tactical votes. So the Lib Dems would then come back with, what, 30, 35 MPs. And if the arithmetic is right, and if the Labour Party plays ball, we then get an agreement to have electoral reform, proper electoral reform, with getting rid of the first past the post system. And once that happens, and you get genuinely proportional voting, and probably something like the German system or the Scottish system, you then have the Lib Dems have a meaningful long-term role.
Okay, yeah, interesting insight. I think one of the things that has been evident over the last few years that a lot of members on the kind of Progressive Alliance have talked about is tactical voting, especially in regards to the Lib Dems. So, you know, how do you feel about tactical voting as a way of winning elections, considering we had places like Esher and Walton in the last election, Chingford and Woodward Green, which, you know, you had a lot of people begging parties to sign up to tactical voting or for, you know, to stop campaigning in those seats to let the other win. Do you think tactical voting is something that, you know, we should keep pursuing, or is it a kind of slippery slope back to being
I don't think we have any alternative in the short run to do anything else. I mean, it's a difficult conversation to have with people because people quite understandably like to vote for the people they want, you know, who they identify with, where they have shared values. But the problem is that the first past the post voting system produces very, very distorted outcomes. And it's at the moment, it provides the Conservatives with an enormous inbuilt advantage. So if we're going to get past that, and we're going to get a government that will change Britain, and including political reform, we're going to have to change the government. And that can only happen with tactical voting. And at the last election, I had retired by that point, but I was a strong advocate of tactical voting. I encouraged Labour people to vote Lib Dem in some of the areas I've just listed, but I publicly said, if you live in Canterbury, you should vote for the Labour candidate. I think she did get in, actually, but you know, there were other places where we had to be equally disciplined. It's difficult for a party leader to go out and say that, but you know, people like me who have influence, but you know, can say what we want. I think we have a duty to go out and encourage relevant tactical voting.
Yeah, well, I quite agree with that. And finally, on this kind of future section, recently on the Andrew Marr show, the leader of the Lib Dems, Sir Ed Davey, was quoted in saying that the Lib Dems are not the party of rejoin anymore, which has led to a lot of kind of arguments, etc., online, as you can imagine. So if we're not the party of rejoin anymore, then what is the USP of the Lib Dems? Is it, you know, internationalism? Is it universal basic income? What should it be?
Well, I think we shouldn't campaign on rejoining the European Union, but I think the Lib Dems, as part of their USP, have to be the pro-Europe party and you know, working towards a much better relationship with the European Union than Johnson has got on this very flimsy treaty. I think there's a large space because Starmer is trying to close down the whole issue. He doesn't want to talk about Europe because it's a problem for the Labour Party. Half their supporters are Brexiteers and the other half are Remainers. It's not a problem for the Lib Dems. I think we should say, you know, we are the party that wants, as internationalists, to have a leading role in Europe. This isn't going to happen by rejoining the European Union. I mean, quite apart from anything else, I doubt that the European Union would have us. You know, the British have caused immense trouble. You know, why would they want to get involved in complex British politics? So I don't think rejoining is an issue, but a new arrangement, which had at its very minimum rejoining the customs union, or possibly had a kind of Norwegian type structure, or you know, something ambitious, which took us more within the European orbit. I think that's something we should campaign for and would represent a key thing for the party. In terms of other USPs, I think the whole area of political reform, which isn't, of course, just about the voting system, but it's about, you know, powers for local community and the fact that Britain is the most centralized country in Europe, is horribly badly governed. You know, just reforming the whole political system, which is just rotten. I mean, it's partly about decentralization and local governments, partly getting rid of the House of Lords in its present form. It's dealing with party funding. I mean, there's a whole set of issues that the Lib Dems should be leading on because nobody else is going to do it. So I think there's, there are issues there, and there will be issues in social policy, particularly education, where the Lib Dems have traditionally been distinctive and strong, which we should be focusing on.
Lovely, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to touch on one more thing from me before I hand back to Bradley, and then we go to the audience questions. You talked a bit about Europe there, and I think I'd be a bit remiss if I didn't touch on Brexit and your work as one of, if not perhaps its most important vocal opponent to Brexit. But I want to start with a quote, which I found, which is rather interesting. And I know that you've addressed this before, but I'd ask you to address it again, which is in 2016, you said, trying to overturn the Brexit referendum with another referendum would be utterly counterproductive and seriously disrespectful. So in simple terms, what changed?
Well, what changed was something else that happened in 2016, which was the Lancaster House speech. I took the view after the referendum. I wasn't in Parliament. I'd been campaigning for remaining in Europe, but I wasn't in Parliament. But when the referendum went the wrong way, I took the view, yeah, you've got to respect the result. And what I thought Remainers should be doing was working for a very close relationship with the European Union, but accepting the fact that the referendum had gone the other way. Then Theresa May gave the Lancaster House speech and said she wanted, the Tory party wanted, to take Britain out of the customs union, to take it out of the single market, to sever all the links, things like the Erasmus program, the European Investment Bank, all the, a lot of non-political but very valuable things we're party to, and really destroying the relationship with Europe far beyond the mandate of the referendum. So at that point, I did change my mind. I thought, this is not what people voted for, and we've got to reopen it. I think the other reason I shifted my emphasis on this whole issue was that it seems to me quite right to say that you should respect a referendum result, but then to say we want a confirmation of the end result of the negotiations. I mean, what I argued for when I was leader was not a second referendum. I didn't use that phrase. I said, what we need is a confirmatory referendum. We need to look at the government negotiated agreement and then ask the British people to decide, is this what you voted for? Is this what you want? And I think that was a more kind of respectful and I would have hoped more successful pitch than the one we made. I thought it was absolutely disastrous to go into the election saying would revoke it without consulting anybody. I mean, that just lost us so much support. It wasn't true.
Sorry, I was muted. I think that that is fair, and certainly the Labour Party seemed to suffer quite greatly for the same reason, which is that people clearly felt that get Brexit done was the most effective and the most persuasive platform. Some did argue though that one of the reasons why Labour performed so poorly in the last election was because of a lack of a credible opposition to the government. Do you think that there's any truth to that? And do you think that it's changed since Sir Keir Starmer was elected as leader?
Yes, I do think. I mean, Corbyn was an utter disaster. Large numbers of traditional Labour voters wouldn't go anywhere near him, partly because he was not seen as being, I put patriotic in quotation marks, but he didn't sort of identify with Britain. A lot of people thought that. His economic policy was completely off the wall. And there was this kind of anti-Semitism thing. I mean, I don't know how much of that was actually true, but it sort of A lot of people in the Labour Party were saying it, so damaged his reputation terribly. And I think actually we need to go back even till 2017, when the Labour Party did quite well under his leadership. What actually did for the Lib Dems in 2017, people have, I think, forgotten this now, and 2015, was that the Tories ran a very successful campaign around the dangers of having Labour plus the SNP in government, and they personalised it very much around Jeremy Corbyn. The reason I lost my seat in 2015 wasn't primarily because of tactical Labour voters abandoning me, though some did. It was because people were frightened of having a Labour plus SNP government. So Labour leadership, initially under Miliband and then under Corbyn, was an absolutely critical factor in them going backwards rather when they should have been going forwards.
Okay. Right, so yeah, just before we go into audience questions then, I'll just have one last question that I want to ask you personally, if that's okay. And it's about universal basic income. And Andrew Yang famously, or arguably, made it kind of more famous than it was during the Democratic debates over in America. And recently, the Lib Dems have voted for universal basic income as a policy at the last conference in some form. So I just wanted to get your view on, what is your opinion on universal basic income, and is it something that the Lib Dems should advertise more as one of our policies?
Well, this is an awkward question because I'm not a party spokesman, and if I'm giving my honest personal opinion, it's different from the party line. You're right, the party has adopted it. The Greens have, I think the Labour Party are moving that direction. I'm highly sceptical because it isn't a policy. I mean, it's just a framework. I mean, you can have a good universal basic income or a bad one. It depends what level it is, which is why in the United States, you've got, people like Andrew Yang who are arguing from what you might call a progressive point of view. But there are a lot of very right-wing Americans arguing for universal basic income because they want to give people enough money so they don't starve, but then have no more taxes. Just let people go their own way and no state support for education, health. Just let people be. Just give them a universal basic income and that's it. So it depends very much what level you pitch it at. I also think it's a simple answer to a very complex set of problems, and the context in which we operate in the UK is that, of course, we have the universal credit, which was an attempt to amalgamate 6 different benefits into one and to simplify the system. Which was a very good idea, and it really actually is where universal basic income comes in. It's sort of vast simplification of the system. But the problem is if it's not done generously and recognizing the vast variations that exist between people in different parts of the country, different rent levels, you create enormous injustices and anomalies. Rent and housing allowance is a good example. It's part of the current universal credit. But how do you allow for that in the universal basic income? Because an income in Burnley will buy you an awful lot more in terms of rent and purchase of property than it does in London. So what level do you pitch it at? Do you have a different universal basic income for different parts of the country, or do you just have one level, in which case it's massively unfair and creates a lot of anomalies? So I don't think that this, I worry actually that we're running away from trying to address some of the real problems with the welfare system. The universal credit needs to be made more flexible, this horrible 6-week wait, the treatment of self-employed people. I mean, there are a lot of anomalies that need sorting, and we're taking our attention away from that to focus on some utopian ideal solution that actually isn't ideal anyway.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. We'll jump over to audience questions and then we'll finish up with the quick fire. But yes, just a few audience questions first. So we have our first one from Isidore, who asks, from your point of view as an expert in economics, what are your thoughts on austerity and do you think it was required?
Well, I'm not sure everybody would regard me an expert in economics. I probably do, but may not be universally shared. What does austerity mean? It's one of the most abused words in the English language. Does it mean that government should never balance their budgets? Does it mean we should be cutting current spending or capital spending? What is the share of GDP that should be in the public sector? It's become a kind of universal term of abuse for any difficult decision you have to make about public spending, and it doesn't help us very much. I mean, there are times when you do need to have austerity if a government's budget has got out of control. We had that at various points in history, but there are periods when you don't apply budget reduction, deficit reduction, and cuts in public spending. Like now, I mean, this is the worst possible time to do it because it would add to the depression in the economy, and it's cheap to borrow. So this is not a time to have what some people call austerity, but there will come a time when it is the right thing to do. So I worry about this word. It's not an economic concept. It's just a bit of verbal confetti that is sort of thrown around.
Okay. We have a question from Sean, who asks, the House of Lords, a reform to an elected chamber, or should we just abolish it altogether or keep it as it is?
Well, again, I'm probably not giving the party line here. The party view is that we need to reform it. I was one of a small number of MPs who voted with people like Dennis Skinner to abolish it altogether. I think probably on reflection, it would be better to have a reformed House. But the problem is nobody can agree what the reform is. And the reason why we had this paralysis and why Nick Clegg's, I think, very, very well-intentioned, well-thought-through reforms didn't get anywhere in 2012 was that everybody in the House of Commons has a different view about how the House of Lords should be reformed. So nothing ever happens. So I got very impatient and said, well, just get rid of the damn thing. So that may not be very helpful, but that's my sort of instinctive view. I'm not in the House of Lords, as you probably noticed. I mean, I did have the chance of going in 2015, but I took the view that I didn't wish to. And I stood for Parliament again. I thought that was more important than sloping off to the upper chamber.
Once again, muted. Thanks very much for that, Sir Vince. What we'll do now, just because I can see that we are a bit constrained by time, is that we'll jump over to the audience questions. Sorry, not the audience questions, the quickfire questions. We have a few of those. Take as much or as little time as you want to answer them, but they're designed to basically get your first response, your first thought in response to each of these. And so the first one is, who is the best dancer that you've ever seen on Strictly Come Dancing? And you are not allowed to say yourself.
Oh, well, some of the professionals are wonderful. I mean, Oti, is absolutely wonderful dancer. She's won twice in succession. So yeah, that's my answer.
Good answer. What's your go-to lockdown activity?
Cycling. I'm staying with my wife on a small farm, but we make a point of going out every day for proper exercise. We go for long walks in the New Forest, or alternatively we bike. And she's got an electric bike, I've got a push bike, and we try to do a good circuit every day.
Oh, lovely. I'm afraid not that much we can go out and do in far west London, but the next one is I guess we normally ask our guests what book would they recommend that students read, But I suppose in this situation, you mentioned a few of your own books, the ones that you're currently working on. So I guess it's twofold. So one, what's a book that you would recommend students to read, which is not your own? But of the books that you've published, which of them would you suggest students look at?
Well, my latest one, which is Money and Power, is one I'm quite proud of because I've spent a lot of time working on it and thinking about it, and it's a more mature work than many of the others I've read. I've written, sorry. In terms of reading, I do read copiously. I can't think of any particular one, but I think my favorite author is just died, which is Le Carre. So wonderful writer, creating the spirit of espionage and the kind of conflicts of values that you get. A wonderful, wonderful writer. So probably read the latest Le Carre novel would be my advice.
All right, I'll just jot that down. So as we mentioned before the event, Bradley here is a Liberal Democrat. And we like to tease him every now and then at the Society for being a potential future leader of the party. And this was a question that I wanted to ask more generally about your experience since you stepped down as leader. But what advice would you give to a party leader? Or in this instance, what advice, should Bradley one day become the Liberal Democrat leader, what advice would you give him in how to lead a party?
Well, you've got to start at the bottom. I mean, it sounds an obvious thing, a bit trite, but you've got to get a constituency. You've got to be secure. Paddy Ashdown did this in Yeovil, and he was adored in Yeovil, and it gave him the security and the base to campaign from in the West Country. We've lost a lot of it, but in Paddy's time, it was secure. Charles Kennedy had it in the Highlands of Scotland. And the thing in a way I'm proudest of is that when I left Parliament, I left it to Munira Wilson, my seat, who has the biggest majority of any Liberal Democrat who has ever contested a general election. And that was a local base that I'd built up. So my first advice is don't think about the leadership. Think about creating a strong, secure local base before you do anything else. The leadership will come if your time is right.
Well, Bradley, I hope you heed those very wise words. I read an article that you wrote in The Guardian in 2015 where you talked about your prediction that then Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, was the likely successor to David Cameron as Prime Minister. Many agreed with you at the time, and in fact, many agree with the idea that the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, is the likely favourite to succeed Boris Johnson. Do you think that there's a compelling case for that?
No, I mean, Osborne's chances were burnt, with the referendum. I mean, he didn't push for it. Actually, it was Cameron who pushed for the Brexit referendum. Osborne advised against it. But once it had happened, Osborne was one of the cheerleaders for Remain. I mean, it destroyed him politically. There was no way. In terms of now, I don't think Sunak is the favourite anymore. I mean, he was popular when he was signing lots of checks and handing out lots of money. It's easy to be popular when you do that. I think he's now losing a lot of popularity as he's having to make difficult decisions. And I think he's actually making a mistake by doing a premature consolidation of the budget. But either way, I think a lot of people are getting very impatient with him. And I would be surprised if I had to put money now, I would say probably Jeremy Hunt will re-emerge.
Interesting. I've not actually heard Hunt as a candidate, but I suppose we'll have to wait and see. Who's your favourite Prime Minister in British history?
Difficult. Well, although he wasn't liberal, I think Attlee was rather good, low key, very effective. Lloyd George was very effective, but not as a prime minister. He was excellent as a chancellor, as a minister in the government. 19th century, the one I've written about is Peel, actually, who was a Tory, but emerges, from my study of him as a really interesting character who rose to the crisis of the 1840s, brought in free trade, abolished the Corn Laws, was very courageous, split his party, formed an alliance with the Liberals and shook the place up and did the right thing in the national interest. So if you're asking me to give you a name, I'd probably choose him.
All right. And then just the last one from me. In a short sentence or in a word, how would you describe the cabinet meetings during the coalition government?
Well, the cabinet meetings were uneventful. I think it is important to understand this, that cabinet does not make decisions. The decisions are made beforehand, usually in small groups in the coalition. We used to have special advisors who used to negotiate with each other. And then we would have a group of people, Nick Clegg, Danny Alexander, sometimes myself, who would negotiate with a group of Tories on an issue. The cabinet really just was a formal a bit of theatre, really. We had one occasion when, after the referendum on proportional representation or the alternative vote, when people lost their tempers, famously Chris Huhne threw a whole lot of documents across the table. But by and large, cabinet was the least important part of the week.
That's very interesting. I guess it's not perhaps what you might expect. In a way,
No,
it makes a great deal of sense as well. But thank you very much for joining us this evening, Sir Vince. I very much enjoyed it, and I hope you and the audience did as well. As I mentioned earlier, we have many events coming up that we are very excited for, including a large number of socials. And next week, we just happen to have 4 of those, with a film screening, a members meet and greet, a debate, and also a quiz. So do make sure that you like the Politics Society Facebook page to find out when we have these events. And please do join us for them. You can also get a society membership. We put the link for that in the comment section of the video. Thank you all very, very much for joining us tonight. And I hope we can all see you very soon.